My name is Margarita Balmaceda. Most of you know me as a research associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Institute and as professor of international relations and diplomacy at Seton University in New Jersey. I am also a full member of the Naukova Tovaritstva Tarasa Shevchenko. I'm very proud to say this because I just became a full member. And I'm affiliated with the Center of Excellence in Choices of Russian Modernization at the Academy of Sciences in Finland. So I have a number of affiliations, but I would say the one that is closest to my heart is that at the Harvard Ukrainian Institute, because it is there that I started to really learn about Ukraine and to learn about Ukrainian energy. My approach to Ukraine and my work in the area is also related to other parts of my life. So I am a person who perhaps is not your typical person in Ukrainian studies. I was born in Argentina, lived there in my childhood, worked there for a few years after the university, and I did not come naturally to Ukrainian studies. It came later in my life. I came to the Harvard Ukrainian Institute in 1996. It's there where I really started to learn and to realize how important energy issues were for Ukraine. This was a period when we were celebrating the first 5 years of Ukrainian independence in 1991. And obviously this was also a period when many people were worried about whether Ukraine would be able to continue to receive energy supplies. But also this was a period of great crisis in the Ukrainian economy as a whole. Ukraine's GDP had decreased by over 50% compared to the GDP in the last Soviet years. And this is the time when I started to deal with energy. And I have continued to work on energy since then from different perspectives through the years, but always keeping an eye on what is happening in Ukraine. So why this book? As I started to work on energy issues, as I started to read about Ukrainian energy issues, I was struck by the fact that many analyses of Ukraine's energy situation, especially coming from the West, were rather superficial. In fact, when we were talking about the energy situation not only of Ukraine, but of other post-Soviet states, there was an emphasis on what I would call the supply side, the supplies that were coming from Russia, from those supply chains coming from the former Soviet Union. But whatever was happening inside the country, be it Ukraine, be it Lithuania, be it Belarus, be it the other post-Soviet states, this was glossed over. Many people talked about Russia's energy weapon, about Russia's energy pressure, but very little was said about what was happening with those supplies once they arrived in the country. Very little was said about how energy policies were actually made or not made. And I was unhappy with this because I felt this was what I would call the lazy approach to understanding energy politics. I also was unhappy about this because I felt that countries like Ukraine were being treated really only as objects. They were assumed to have no say in this situation. They were treated as simply objects of policies coming from outside the country. They were deprived of agency. So I did not like this because I said, well, if we are supporting Ukrainian independence, we have to treat Ukraine as a serious actor and not simply as a receiver of policies made outside the country. But I also knew, I had a hunch, that in any kind of situation, what happens inside the country also matters. There are very few situations where a country's economic situation or energy situation is dictated solely by an actor outside its borders. So this is when I really started to look more deeply into the issue. And I was very lucky to receive a Fulbright grant to do research in Ukraine at the Razumkov Center in 2003. This is when I really, 2004, I'm sorry. started to work with Ukrainian materials, started to understand the Ukrainian energy situation from the perspective of Ukrainian energy actors. So I did a lot of work reading bulletins and internal information from different business associations in Ukraine, business actors, refineries, pipeline operators, and so on. So to get a different perspective, to really understand what until now we had simply considered a black box or black hole, if you wish, trying to see things from inside. So in general, my approach to energy issues, not only concerning Ukraine, but the whole Western post-Soviet area, is trying to look at them from inside and from below. So I understand their impulses coming from external actors, the European Union, Russia, but I try to understand how this energy situation or policy situation is affected by the actions, choices, and constraints faced by domestic actors. As we look back into the early period of Ukrainian independence, into the mid-1990s, as we look back into that period in hindsight, we know that key domestic actors had a tremendous impact on energy policies, and I'm talking here first and foremost about the role of former Prime Minister Pavlo Lazarenko. We now know that he hijacked energy policy in one area, Dnipropetrovsk, but also tried to hijack energy policy in the whole of the country. And perhaps this is the most clear example of how domestic political groups or political actors try to influence policy, but there are many other examples. And what I tried to do in a previous book, my first book on Ukraine was a smaller book, Energy Dependency, Politics and Corruption in the former Soviet Union, Russia's Power, Oligarchs, Profits, and Ukraine's Missing Energy Policy, 1995-2006. And what I found out by researching this book, and I did a lot of research for this book during that previous grant and a Fulbright grant in Ukraine, what I understood, sadly, is that a lot of what we called Ukraine's energy policy in this period was not really energy policy, was the result of policies intended for other purposes. For example, policies intended to balance the role of a number of interest groups, to reward certain actors, or policies that were simply the result of the influence and impact of those actors on Ukrainian policymaking. And let me give you two examples. The first example, I already mentioned, the case of Lazarenko, his energy company, which which of course Yulia Tymoshenko was also related to, and their monopolization of energy supplies in Dnipropetrovsk and also Donetsk and in the whole country, but also, for example, the creation in 1997 of NAK Naftogaz, the national oil and gas company. That company, which we sometimes associate with the idea of a national energy champion, actually that company was specifically created with two purposes. One, to limit Lazarenko's control of energy revenue, but also as an instrument for rent seeking through energy. So already through the work on this book, I got to appreciate how domestic factors were affecting energy policy in Ukraine. And it was very difficult to do this, to write this book, because, well, it deals with corruption. Certainly, I did not go to Ukraine and start interviewing people and asking them, what was your role in this or that or the other corrupt scheme? Yes, so I had to keep, and I do still keep, a low profile because I want to protect my research and my family. But I could use a variety of not easy to get, but open sources which verified my hunches on the issue. And in this book in particular, I was able to really analyze the main 5, 6, 7 main corrupt schemes in oil business and in natural gas business. And I have a whole chapter in which I analyze how these schemes worked before 1997, that is before the creation of NAC Naftogaz, and between 1997 and 2004. So if we look back at the first 25 years of Ukrainian independence, we will see that until 2014, and some people would argue until today, corruption has played an important role, but the ways in which it has manifested itself have changed, and of course the governance environment through which society can defend itself against corruption has also changed. But I was able to analyze that very clearly in this book. Very hard work. And the book we're talking about today is a different book. It's a bigger book. It's a book in which I compare the role of domestic politics in what I call the management of energy dependency in 3 post-Soviet states: Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. I know Ukraine and Belarus best because I have worked in these 2 countries repeatedly. The Fulbright grant I mentioned, I also had 2 Fulbright grants in Belarus. I wrote a separate book on Belarus later on, but I also included Lithuania. I did field research in Lithuania. I did not learn Lithuanian. It was very hard, but I was also able to understand how this worked in the case of Lithuania. And the basic idea of this book was I wanted to understand how the domestic political context in each of these 3 states affected the way each of these countries were able to deal with their energy dependency on Russia. So at the time I wrote this book, I published it at the end of 2013, there was a feeling that it would be very hard to move away from energy dependency on Russia. We can talk about that separately. But I also had the feeling that you could deal with this dependency in a variety of ways. So I started the book trying to understand how the different political situations and different governance situations in these 3 states affected the management of this energy relationship. And I certainly found out that it did matter, as I discuss in the book, but I also found out something else, which I actually think is even more interesting. I found out that this was a circle. Yes, the way the political system worked affected the way energy policy was made, affected the way energy dependency on Russia was managed, but in turn, the way this management took place came back to affect the political system and to reinforce or not reinforce certain patterns in political life. And this was seen quite clearly in each of the 3 cases. So here we have energy policy, we have governance, and the relationship goes a full circle. We are talking about a long period, and some of these key findings change according to the period. But if we are talking in particular about the period until 2011, new gas contracts with Russia, very sharp increase in the price of gas going to Ukraine. Of course, we had seen increases already until in 2006. But if we talk about what I call the classic period of energy dependency, in particular the period I'm covering in this book, 1996, 2006, Kuchma period, plus, minus. The key finding I made concerning that period is that most key players in Ukraine had absolutely no incentive to move away from energy dependency on Russia. Energy dependency on Russia was very profitable for a variety of key actors. It was very profitable for, if we take one very extreme situation for those corrupt actors that were involved in energy trade with Russia. It was profitable for them because they were able to manipulate energy policy in such a way so that the benefits of certain ways of trading or importing energy from Russia would accrue to them, but the costs would accrue to the Ukrainian budget, and in particular to future Ukrainian generations. So it was very profitable for corrupt actors, but it was also very profitable for, and we're talking here again about the period until 2006, for the so-called red directors, for the directors of large companies which did not really have to pay the real cost of energy. And in a certain sense, through the way this was managed, I would not say that it was profitable for regular users, but they did not feel the cost of energy dependency. So the way energy dependency was dealt with, again, I'm emphasizing here we are talking specifically about the period until 2006, and with some caveats, 2011, it was by socializing the cost of energy dependency, but not making it directly impacting any particular actor. So basically the cost of energy dependency was socialized into Ukrainian budget deficits, into the need for international loans, and basically it was put into the future as something to be paid by future generations. So the first finding I had is that most Ukrainian actors until 2006 had very little incentive to move away from energy dependency. And in fact, many key actors, and especially in the early independence, post-independence period, did not have a Ukraine-centered view of energy security. This changes, but if we are looking at the early 1990s, mid-1990s, there was very little in terms of a conceptualization of Ukraine's autonomous interest in energy independence, for example. This comes on later. A second key finding, and this is going to take me perhaps a little bit later into the 1990s and 2000s, is that as more and more actors within Ukraine start to become concerned about possible increases in natural gas prices, oil prices, and as this becomes more of a political issue, key political actors discover, I would say, the value of what I would call an artificial securitization of energy issues. That is, talking about the danger of energy dependency, using energy dependency either existing or the fear of increased dependency as a key word in relations with domestic constituencies, but also with international actors like the European Union, the IMF, the World Bank. But at the same time, using this as a facade to continue engaging in energy policies which did not represent Ukraine's interests. That's perhaps my second key finding. A third key finding is that cheap energy is not always good. And here, let me go back to what I mentioned before about many Ukrainian actors not having a Ukraine-centered view of energy security until after 2006, perhaps. And many actors were focused on cheap energy, but cheap energy had a huge set of repercussions on the Ukrainian energy economy, on the Ukrainian economy in general, and on Ukrainian domestic and foreign policies. So, for example, if we talk about cheap energy, this means the emphasis on certain types of contractual relationships with Russia, which would allow, let's say, the import price of natural gas to remain low. For many years, it was $50 per 1,000 cubic meters. A set of arrangements that would allow residential prices to remain very low. But we're also talking about a situation where oil and natural gas produced in Ukraine and also coal produced in Ukraine was sold to different economic actors within Ukraine at a very low price. So all of these things, which now I'm putting under the umbrella of low energy prices, created a situation where there was little incentive to move to more efficient energy use. There was little incentive to produce natural gas and oil within Ukraine, and also created a system where a number of economic actors could avoid the payment of taxes. So at the level of the energy industry, cheap prices kept Ukraine away from the need to modernize its economy and rewarded certain actors which avoided the payment of taxes through this. At the same time, quote-unquote, cheap energy prices perpetuated a certain system of energy relations with Russia and kept Ukraine from really assessing the real cost of this energy dependency. Because no actor in Ukraine had to directly pay the cost of this dependency here now, the cost of alternatives, such as building new pipelines, connecting to other pipelines to receive perhaps natural gas supplies from Norway. The cost of those infrastructure projects compared to the cost of importing from Russia at those prices seemed impossible to afford, and locked Ukraine for many years into a certain pattern that really kept Ukraine from modernizing its economy, kept Ukraine from really looking at a broader set of energy options. So that's, I think, my fourth key finding. If you look at the infrastructure aspect of the situation, we know that in the case of natural gas imports, you, as an importer, have much less choices than in the case of oil. In the case of oil, there's always a possibility of importing it through tankers from other suppliers. In the case of natural gas, until the recent increase in the use of liquefied natural gas, but that was really not a player in the Ukrainian context, you are really tied to supplies by pipeline. So I would say that would be the most vulnerable sector, because Ukraine did not have any way of replacing those natural gas supplies unless there would be a very capital-intensive building of pipelines to connect with other suppliers. So I would say that would be the most vulnerable system. If we're talking about today, which is a different set of issues, and I'm not dealing with that obviously in this book, today I see a lot of vulnerability in the case of coal. We seldom talk about coal, but right now it's a key issue of vulnerability because many coal supplies that key power plants depend on are located in territory that is not controlled by the central Ukrainian government. And this opens a whole set of issues. But for the period I'm talking about, I would say that natural gas would be the most vulnerable sector. The way the pricing system for natural gas worked made natural gas a very good area for rent-seeking and corruption. So let me remind you that until 1996, residential prices for natural gas used for cooking, for heating, those prices were kept at very, very low prices, a very low cost for the end user, lower than in Russia, lower than in Belarus. And this is important because the coexistence of a variety of prices for the same good, so one price for industrial users, one price for residential consumers, one price for social objects such as schools and hospitals, this allowed corrupt actors to manipulate this, to label natural gas that was used by industries or that was re-exported as residential use. So this allowed for many, many manipulations that you did not see in other areas. In the case of oil, actually prices had been liberalized much earlier, and it did not allow such type of manipulations to take place. In the case of oil, we also saw manipulations, but of different type. For example, there were many manipulations related to tax-free imports of oil products, manipulations related to the creation of companies that only lasted one day, that were specifically created to import oil and then disappeared, leaving the bill for somebody else. But I would say that those actors concentrated especially in the natural gas area, where the infrastructure also made it easier to monopolize supplies to industrial users. So, for example, if you look at the Donetsk area, you saw a whole cycle which involved natural gas imports, but also the monopolization of coal supplies from Ukraine itself. So I would say natural gas was the weakest link in the energy system. It was the part of the system that allowed for the most significant manipulation, but it was not the only one. And we can see these manipulations in each energy sector. So if we're talking here about the period 1997 and forward, in 1997, the NAK Naftogaz Ukraine was created, bringing together the key assets in transit and transportation, and a number of sub-companies of NAK Naftogaz were also created. What we have been seeing after 2014 is the so-called unbundling of NAK Naftogaz, by which the assets that were related to production and the assets related to transit are being separated. Refineries in Ukraine were a mixture of state-owned and privately owned. And unfortunately, today, that sector has been greatly reduced. When I started working on Ukraine, there were 7 major refineries. Today, only one, the Kremenchuk refinery, only one is working, and that is privately controlled. The other key element of Ukraine's ownership situation concerning energy is that in many cases you had companies that were formally state-owned but were privately controlled. And many of you and many of your viewers may be familiar with the case of Ukr-Nafta, which was and continues to be state-owned, but which for many years was de facto controlled by the Privat company of Ihor Kolomoisky. So it is a mixture of private and state ownership. And at the same time, you have a system of private companies that had been allowed to produce oil in Ukraine, and that is somewhat different set of issues. Private companies producing oil in Ukraine, both domestic companies and foreign companies. I'm not going to be suggesting anything very original here. I think there is a consensus that the real cost of energy has to be taken account of. There is a consensus that a country can only take full responsibility of its energy future when the full cost of energy is taken account of, and when this has a social price to be paid, then you need to use targeted subsidies to support the especially vulnerable sectors of the population. So my first recommendation would be make sure that the kind of manipulations we have seen around underpriced energy are not possible by moving energy to its full economic cost, but also dealing with the social costs of this by using targeted subsidies. For many years, there was a system of subsidization of all residential users, which did not really make sense because you were subsidizing also very wealthy users. So targeted subsidies for those sectors that really need it. My second suggestion would be to take very seriously the issue of renewable energy. And this has two components. First, it can reduce Ukraine's dependency. But secondly, if renewable energy is dealt with in a way that is proactive and consequent, this can put Ukraine in line with the leading economies of Europe, in particular Germany, which are making a business out of developing industries which are based on renewable energy. So this is an element that can help modernize the Ukrainian economy at a time when it really needs modernization. This is also the second element is also very important if we are talking about what can happen with the territories which are currently occupied. Should these territories come back fully under Ukrainian control, what kind of economic system is going to be supported there? Because the political economic system that was installed, that was in place in Donetsk, in Donbass, a system based on energy-intensive industries, on energy inefficiency, this system cannot exist anymore. So if we are going to support renewable energy, that can also help deal with the issue of how to reintegrate these territories. Thirdly, I would strongly suggest paying very high importance to transparency. Transparency meaning not only a governance system that identifies corruption before it happens or as soon as it happens and prevents it, but also a governance system where the role of corporate governance is also very clearly dealt with. Many of the issues that we have seen in Ukraine concerning corruption in the energy sector have to deal with faulty or faultily implemented corporate governance issues, where private actors have been allowed to control the policies of formerly state-owned companies. So that is an area where we have already seen progress in the last 2 years, but it's an area that is going to be key in order to prevent manipulations and corruption. Fifth, I would greatly suggest that the government of Ukraine is very careful in terms of how much reliance it places on significant economic actors with energy interests. We have seen after 2014 a situation where the Ukrainian government had to rely on actors such as Kolomoisky, even without him being a governor or after he resigned as governor. And this is a very problematic situation because these are economic actors which have other interests and not only the well-being of Ukraine. So I would certainly emphasize these 5 areas. In the last 2 years, we have seen very big changes in terms of Ukraine's patterns of energy imports. If Ukraine was 10 years ago importing 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia, in the last year, Ukraine imported none or almost none natural gas from Russia. So in one sense, one could say this is sustainable. We also know that this was possible in part because there has been a very significant recession in Ukraine, and many of the companies that were using this natural gas aren't using it. So to a certain extent, you can say it is doable, but it is not doable without a recalibration of energy use policies by major industries. Should it be a goal? I think there is disagreement on this. Many people would argue it should be a goal. Other people would argue if importing energy is economically, it makes sense economically, there is no problem with this. The issue is when you import too much energy from only one source, and in particular, when you import most of your energy using only one type of contractual arrangement. So we have for many years talked about Ukraine's geographical dependency on Russia, But this is not the only issue. The issue is also what kind of contracts are used by this. So I would argue Ukraine needs to diversify. Yes, more reliance on domestic source of energy, but I would say here renewable energy should be one of the key pillars in terms of domestic supplies. But also, as Ukraine looks at external supplies, diversify not only the sources, but also the contractual form. So Ukraine now is importing natural gas that is being Russian origin natural gas that has been re-imported contractually from Slovakia, from Hungary. Ukraine needs to look at the contracts that are there. Are we talking about year-long contracts? Are we talking about spot price contracts? Should Ukraine be looking into not only the resupply of Russian origin natural gas, but at the import of natural gas from Norway, for example? So I would argue that you need a basket of supplies. Insisting on only domestic sources is not going to be realistic, because then you do not have a competition that allows for pressure to lower prices. And I do not think that in the case of Ukraine, it is something which is realistic in the short term. So I would argue for a basket of sources, but paying a lot of attention to renewable sources and paying a lot of attention to contractual diversification. Ukraine's energy situation after Russia's incursion into eastern Ukraine has had two aspects. On the one hand, it has mobilized domestic resources and has allowed Ukraine to stop importing for a period some types of Russian energy, such as natural gas. But at the same time, it has made Ukraine more vulnerable. You have talked about the possibility of blowing up a pipeline and so on. In the case of natural gas, this is not likely to happen, because those natural gas pipelines are also used for the transit of Russian gas to Western Europe. And those Russian actors which are exporting that natural gas have an interest for that natural gas to reach Western Europe so that they can get paid for that gas. I would say the biggest point of vulnerability right now concerns that significant subportion of Ukrainian power plants, so electricity generating plants, which, because of a whole set of dependencies from the Soviet period, had been specified to work with certain types of coal that was mined in particular in certain areas of Donbass, which are now not under central control. And right now, I would say this is the major vulnerability faced by Ukraine, because Ukraine should not be importing coal from those territories. And that in principle is not being imported, but in reality it is. And this is a whole political issue, because then this can be construed as support, economic support for actors in those occupied territories. Ukraine is importing coal from Russia, but Ukraine is also importing coal from other areas, from South Africa, and to a very small extent from certain mines controlled by Metinvest or owned by Metinvest in the United States. But in terms of day-to-day functioning of its energy system, and in particular its electricity system, coal from Donbass and from the occupied areas is right now the largest vulnerability. I would say that there are some specificities. So let's say that these three states started out in a somewhat similar situation. There were the three of them rather heavily dependent on Russian energy. Belarus the most, Lithuania and Ukraine to a broadly similar level. But there were two key differences that can explain how things have developed after 1991. One has to do with, as I mentioned before, the domestic political system, and the other has to do with economic policy. So if we look at differences in political system, what we saw is that In the case of Belarus, we did not have a system of competing so-called clans, as we had in the case of Ukraine. We had a situation where policy was much more controlled by one single actor, and that being President Lukashenko, and that did not allow energy corruption to move in the way it moved in Ukraine. So in the case of Belarus, you did not see energy policy de facto as a means of balancing the interests of these different groups. You rather saw it as part of the political game of one particular actor, that being the president. So I am not saying that there has been no energy corruption in the case of Belarus, but it played a different role than it played in Ukraine. On the other set of the spectrum, in Lithuania, certainly there were key cases of energy corruption, but they were rather swiftly identified by the political system and dealt with by the political system in a way that took much longer to happen in Ukraine. The second key difference we saw between these three states is how the economic policies of the early years affected the way different economic actors and energy actors would look at their interests. In the case of Ukraine, oil and oil product prices were liberalized rather early, but natural gas prices, especially for residential users, remained subsidized, remained controlled for many, many years until today, to a certain extent. In the case of Lithuania, prices also for natural gas were liberalized much earlier. And while this meant a very big social shock, this also meant that there was not really the possibility of playing with different prices for the same good between different sectors, between different subsectors of the same market. It was simply not there. So it was not possible to manipulate the difference between, let's say, natural gas for residential users at $50 per 1,000 cubic meters versus $300 for certain types of industrial users. And this meant that certain types of corruption could simply not take place in Lithuania. There was also energy corruption, there was also natural gas corruption, but it did not reach the same level as in Ukraine. So in that sense, it really did matter what kind of governance system you had in place, but also what kind of economic policies were taken in the early post-independence period. And in particular, whether different sub-markets for the same good were allowed to exist. If you have different prices, this opens the door for manipulation, which is simply not there once you equalize prices. Yes, so it is affecting Ukraine's energy market first and foremost because a key condition for the signing of those agreements was the transposition to Ukraine of certain energy guidelines set by the European Union. First and foremost, it had to do with, I would say, three issues. One, the restructuring of NAK Naftogaz from a company which, as I mentioned, was for many years used not really for the pursuit of Ukrainian national interest, but for rent-seeking. Secondly, it has to do with the unbundling of transactions that were commingled within NAK Naftogaz, but now are going to be separated between production, transit, and sale. And thirdly, it has to do with a whole larger set of policies having to do with transparency in the energy market, and in particular with transparency in the natural gas market. And a few months ago, there was a new natural gas law that was passed in Ukraine. This is a very important step, and I think it is especially through these laws, through this legislation, that the relationship with the EU, the new agreements can affect. It's not going to be so much in terms of imports from the EU, but it's going to be in terms of how that relationship affects the way the domestic Ukrainian market functions, and whether it can function in a way that is open, that is transparent, which will also help attract foreign investors into the energy sector. I think the one key issue I want to emphasize, and this is actually the topic of the book project I'm working on now, is that dependency cannot be simply looked at as a one-sided street. Some people have talked about mutual dependency in terms of Russia also depending on Ukraine for the export of its natural gas, for example. But what I want to emphasize is that many actors within Ukraine also benefited from being part of a larger set of economic relationships involving the export of Russian energy goods. So when we look at energy, we need to look at it not simply in terms of percentages of dependency, not simply in terms of geographical dependency. We need to look at how it plays itself out throughout a variety of economic sectors. For example, through my new research, I have found out that the coal sector, the metallurgical sector, the natural gas sector, and governance issues in Donetsk were very closely related. And this has to do partially with dependency, but it has to do even more with how energy comes to play a role in larger production chains in the country. And as people read this book, or as people follow up energy issues in a larger context, I want them to keep their eyes open to the ways in which energy supplies not only play a role in terms of arriving in a country, but how they become part of a larger economic, technical, and political system. Well, we still have remaining power of Mr. Firtash in the natural gas area. And in the coal area, you have a large power, significant power of still Mr. Akhmetov and Metinvest, the industrial union of Donbass with Mr. Taruta. So these are players which have been playing a role for the last 15 years and continue to play a role in one way or another. And then a number of other actors playing a smaller role. They are documented areas with both natural gas and oil reserves, both in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. But as you probably know, there have been very complex governance issues having to do with this. When I finished this book, Ukraine had just signed what many people call the deal of the century, through which, and I have it here in my first page, through which some of the Ukrainian oil reserves were going to be developed. That deal century, I believe it was with Chevron, later was put on ice. So I would say the reserves are there, but how are they going to be developed? What is the governance system? What is going to be the legal status of those investments? That is the key issue moving forward. And obviously, as you know, there is a huge issue concerning the status of offshore deposits near the Crimean Peninsula and how does Russian occupation of Crimea is affecting this. So the reserves are there. The question is, both from a governance perspective and from an international law perspective, concerning those offshore areas near Crimea, how are they going to be developed? I had to smile when you talked about there being excitement about this nomination. This is going to be a major issue because lifting sanctions on Russia is not simply about helping Russia produce more oil. It's about allowing Russia to use income from energy exports to rearm, to boost up its domestic regime. So I would consider the impact of that nomination as something going above and beyond energy policy. So I am not going to be concerned mostly or only about what Russian energy policy will do after January 20th. I'm going to be concerned about how policies coming from Washington are going to enable Mr. Putin to continue or increase certain policies which are very troublesome for its neighbors. And certainly I'm talking here about Ukraine, but also about the Baltic states, for example. So I have no doubt that there are many people in Western Europe which are excited about this nomination because they would also like to have those sanctions lifted. They're very important energy players and energy technology players which would like to continue or to resume exports to Russian oil and gas companies. But I think we need to be very careful about what signals are sent to Moscow. And unfortunately, those signals, in my perspective, are not the best, are not the right ones that should be sent. Well, Ukraine has been a key player in the transit of energy. That role is being reduced as Russia is shaping its own export infrastructure. Ukraine is trying to retain that role, which I find in itself a very, very interesting development. But if Ukraine is to look forward to the next century, it has to rethink its role because it cannot control the way Russia exports its energy resources. Obviously, there are other routes that are available to Russia. And I think it will be a different kind of role, and it has to be a role that is based on an energy system which is sustainable. So rather than seeing itself as perhaps the key transit player, it would be a more modest role, but a role that is sustainable from the perspective of domestic actors. And perhaps this is what we need to wish Ukraine, not necessarily to be the most important hydrocarbon transit state, which it was for many years, but to be a country which can have a sustainable energy system that can serve its population, and not only this generation, but the next ones. There have been a number of situations where there has been coordination. There have been discussions about a Black Sea, Baltic Sea corridor in a variety of situations, but that coordination has never gone into a full coordination. I don't want to get too much into the case of Belarus. It's a fascinating case for a number of other reasons. It is a situation where, in theory, there's a very good relationship with Russia, but in reality there isn't, and also energy relations play a role there. But just to answer your question, that coordination has been there, but it has been more sporadical than full-blown coordination. Perhaps what we can wish for is for more coordination between Ukraine and its Baltic neighbors or near neighbors as Ukraine becomes closer to European Union structures and to the European as a member of the European Energy Community and as a country that is fully implementing European energy governance standards. So perhaps this is one thing we can very much hope for and expect to happen.